What if death could be chosen over chains? What if the condemned could find freedom in their final moments, even when their bodies remained bound? In the suffocating heat of a Georgia cotton plantation in 1859, one man discovered that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is not how you live, but how you choose to die. If you're compelled by stories of defiance that echo through history's darkest chapters, subscribe to our channel now and turn on notifications. These are the voices that were silenced, but their courage speaks louder than death itself. The gallows stood like a twisted oak against the blood-red Georgia sky, its shadow stretching across the dusty ground of Riverside Plantation on the morning of August 15, 1859. The wooden structure had been hastily erected in the center of the slave quarters, a deliberate reminder to the 140 souls who called this place their prison that rebellion carried the ultimate price. Josiah Freeman, though, Al Freeman was a name he had given himself, not one bestowed by any master, sat in the cramped tool shed that had become his death row cell, his powerful hands shackled with iron that had worn grooves into his dark skin. At 34, he possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention even in chains. His 6-foot frame carried the muscled evidence of years working the docks in Savannah before his capture, and his intelligent brown eyes held a fire that 20 years of bondage had never extinguished. The events that had brought him to this moment began 3 months ago, but their roots stretched back through a lifetime of accumulated injustices, small resistances, and the growing certainty that some things were worth dying for. Josiah had been born free in Philadelphia to parents who had escaped slavery decades. Before his birth, he had learned to read and write, had worked as a carpenter and dock laborer. He had tasted what it meant to sell his labor rather than his very existence. That freedom had ended. Abruptly on a March evening in 1839, when he was 24 years old. He had been walking home from the docks when 3 men surrounded him in an alley. When he regained consciousness, he was chained in the hold of a ship bound for Savannah, sold into slavery by kidnappers who made their living stealing free blacks. From northern cities, for 15 years, Josiah had moved between plantations, never staying long in one place because his literacy and his memories of freedom made him dangerous. He had a habit of teaching other slaves to read, of sharing stories about life in the North, of quietly organizing work slowdowns and small acts of resistance that drove overseers to distraction. Master Edmund Thornwell had purchased him 6 months ago specifically because of his reputation as a troublemaker. Thornwell was a man who took pride in breaking difficult slaves, and he had heard about Josiah's history through the network of slaveholders, who traded information about rebellious property. Riverside Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Georgia cotton land along the Savannah River. The main house, an imposing Greek Revival mansion with white columns and broad verandas, sat atop a small hill overlooking the fields where nearly 200 enslaved people labored. From dawn to dusk, during cotton season, the slave quarters consisted of 2 long rows of wooden cabins, each housing multiple families in spaces designed for livestock rather than human beings. The overseer was a brutal man named Caleb Morrison. His reputation for cruelty had earned him employment on plantations where other overseers had failed to maintain discipline, carried a bullwhip coiled at his side, and a loaded pistol in his belt. And he used both with the casual violence of a man who had never learned to see enslaved people as human beings. It was Morrison who had provoked the incident that now had Josiah waiting for execution. 3 months ago, he had caught Josiah teaching a group of children to write letters in the dirt behind one of the slave cabins. The lesson had been innocent enough, just showing them how to spell their names, but literacy among slaves was illegal in Georgia, and Morrison saw an opportunity to make an example. He had ordered Josiah stripped and tied to a whipping post in front of the assembled slaves. The punishment was to be 50 lashes, enough to permanently scar but not necessarily kill. It was meant to demonstrate the price of education, the cost of remembering that enslaved people had minds as well as bodies. But as Morrison raised his whip for the first blow, something in Josiah snapped. Perhaps it was the sight of the children he had been teaching, their small faces filled with terror. Perhaps it was the memory of his own childhood in Philadelphia, where learning had been a joy rather than a crime. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulation of 20 years of injustice, finally reaching a breaking point. Whatever the cause, Josiah had broken free from his bonds with a strength born of desperation and fury. The ropes had been tied by men who saw him as property rather than as a human being capable of extraordinary determination. And they had underestimated what a free man could do even in chains. The confrontation that followed lasted only minutes, but its aftermath would reverberate through the plantation for months. Josiah had wrestled the whip from Morrison's hands and turned it on the overseer, delivering blow after blow while years of suppressed rage poured out of him. He had not intended to kill the man, but Morrison's skull had struck the whipping post as he fell, and he had died almost instantly. The other slaves had watched in stunned silence as Josiah stood over Morrison's body, the bloodied whip still in his hands. For a moment, the entire system of plantation discipline had collapsed. The man who had terrorized them for years lay dead, killed by one of their own, and suddenly the impossible seemed possible. But the moment had passed quickly. The other overseers had arrived with dogs and guns, and Josiah had made no attempt to flee. Instead, he had calmly set down the whip and allowed himself to be shackled once again. He had known that his fate was sealed, but he had also known that his actions had meaning beyond his own survival. Master Thornwell had wanted to hang him immediately, but Georgia law required a trial even for enslaved people charged with capital crimes. The proceedings had been a formality. Josiah was not allowed to testify on his own behalf, and no enslaved person could speak against a white man in court. The verdict had been predetermined, but the trial had served its purpose of legitimizing the execution in the eyes of the law. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher and the sounds of preparation for his execution grew louder outside his makeshift cell, Josiah reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He could have continued to endure Morrison's brutality, could have watched the children he cared about grow up illiterate and broken, could have preserved his own life by accepting the whipping that would have left him permanently scarred, but alive. Instead, he had chosen to act, knowing that the action would cost him everything. But in the 3 months since Morrison's death, he had seen changes on the plantation that suggested his sacrifice might not be in vain. The new overseer was still brutal, but he was also more cautious, more aware that the people he supervised were capable of violence when pushed too far. The slaves themselves moved with a different energy, still oppressed, still suffering, but no longer entirely hopeless. Most importantly, the children continued to learn, in secret, in hidden moments. The older slaves had taken up the work that Josiah had begun. They scratched letters in the dirt, whispered lessons about reading and writing, passed on the dangerous knowledge that their minds belonged to them, even if their bodies did not. The door to his cell opened, onto Reverend Samuel McKnight entered. McKnight was the plantation's chaplain, a white minister who held Sunday services for the slaves, and was supposed to teach them Christian submission to their earthly masters. But Josiah had detected something different in the man during their conversations over the past weeks of discomfort with slavery that McKnight tried to hide, but could not entirely suppress. "Good morning, Josiah," McKnight said quietly. "Come to pray with you if you'd like." Josiah studied the minister's face. "I appreciate that, Reverend, but I wonder if you might be willing to do something more than pray." McKnight glanced nervously toward the door. "What do you mean?" From beneath his thin mattress, Foya carefully withdrew a piece of paper, actually several pieces, covered with small, precise handwriting. He had been working on them for weeks, writing with a stub of pencil he had managed to conceal from his guards. "This is my story," he said. "The true story of how I lived and why I'm dying. I'd like someone to make sure it doesn't die with me." Minister took the pages with trembling hands. As his eyes scanned the opening lines, his face went pale. Josiah had written not just about his own life, but about the systematic brutality of slavery, the ways that supposedly Christian masters justified owning other human beings, the daily indignities and casual cruelties that defined plantation life. "I can't," McKnight began, but Josiah interrupted him. "You can," he said firmly. "You're a man of God. You know right from wrong, even if the law and society tell you otherwise. This story needs to be told, and you're the only person who can make sure it reaches people who can do something with it." McKnight stared at the pages for a long moment. Finally, he folded them carefully and slipped them inside his coat. "What do you want me to do with them?" "Send them north," Josiah replied. "There are newspapers there, abolitionists, who will publish the truth about what happens on places like this. Let them know that Josiah Freeman lived, that he was a human, being with thoughts and feelings and dignity, not just property that got out of line." The sound of footsteps outside indicated that the time for his execution was approaching. McKnight stood to leave, but Josiah caught his arm. "There's one more thing," he said. "The children I was teaching there still learning. The knowledge is spreading, even though I won't be here to guide it. Promise me you won't interfere with that. Promise me you'll find ways to help them." McKnight nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I promise." As the minister left, Josiah felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for months. His death would serve a purpose beyond simple punishment. His story would survive, his sacrifice would have meaning, and the spark of rebellion he had ignited would continue to burn. The guards came for him, as the church. Bells in the distant town of Milledgeville chimed 9 o'clock. Master Thornwell had invited neighboring planters to witness the execution, turning it into a social occasion that would reinforce the power of the slave system while providing entertainment for the ruling class. As Josiah was led from his cell toward the gallows, he saw that the entire slave population of Riverside Plantation had been forced to watch. They stood in silent rows, their faces carefully neutral, but he could see the mixture of grief and pride in their eyes. They mourned his death, but they also honored his courage. The scaffold had been built high enough that Josiah could see 4 miles across the Georgia countryside as he climbed the steps. He saw the cotton fields where his people labored under the brutal sun, the river that carried their crops to market and their hopes toward freedom, the forests that had sheltered runaways and hidden the Underground Railroad's secret routes. "Master," Thornwell read the charges against him in a voice meant to carry across the assembled crowd. "Murder of an overseer, inciting rebellion, destruction of property." The words reduced his life to a list of crimes against the system that had stolen his freedom. But Josiah knew that history would remember him differently. When asked if he had any final words, Josiah looked out over the faces of his people and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the plantation grounds. "I was born free," he said. "I lived free for 24 years before they stole that from me. For 20 years after that, I never forgot what freedom felt like. Today, I die free because I choose how to face this moment. No man owns my death, even if they claim to own my life." He paused, his eyes finding the faces of the children he had taught, the adults who had listened to his stories of the North, the friends who had shared his dreams of liberation. "Remember that your minds are your own," he continued. "Remember that knowledge is power, and that power belongs to you no matter what chains they put on your bodies. Remember that every one of you is worth more than all the cotton in Georgia, and don't let anyone tell you different." As the noose was placed around his neck, Josiah thought about his parents in Philadelphia, who had died not knowing what had happened to their son. He thought about the dock workers he had labored alongside in Savannah, who had probably never learned his fate. He thought about all the enslaved people throughout the South who faced the same choices he had faced, the same daily decisions about resistance and survival. Most of all, he thought about the future, the day when slavery would end, when his people would be truly free. When the knowledge he had tried to share would no longer be a crime but a birthright. The trapdoor opened, and Josiah Freeman died as he had lived in his final months on his own terms, with dignity intact, his spirit unbroken by the system. That had destroyed his body, but death was not the end of his story. Reverend McKnight kept his promise. Within a week of the execution, Josiah's manuscript was on its way north, carried by a traveling merchant who sympathized with the abolitionist cause. By September, excerpts were appearing in newspapers throughout New England. By October, the complete narrative had been published as a pamphlet titled The Freeman Papers, a true account of slavery and resistance in Georgia. The impact was immediate and powerful. Northern readers were horrified by Josiah's detailed descriptions of plantation life, moved by his account of being kidnapped from freedom, and inspired by his refusal to be broken by 20 years of bondage. The pamphlet sold thousands of copies and was reprinted in multiple languages. More importantly, Josiah's story reached other enslaved people throughout the South. Literate slaves shared his words with those who could not read. His message of resistance and dignity spread through the underground networks that connected plantations across the region. His name became a rallying cry for those who dreamed of freedom. On Riverside Plantation itself, the changes that had begun with Morrison's death continued to unfold. The new overseer, James Crawford, was no less committed to maintaining discipline. But he had learned from Morrison's fate. He was more careful about pushing individual slaves to their breaking point. More aware that brutality could provoke resistance, the slaves themselves were transformed by Josiah's example. They'd seen one of their own stand up to the system that oppressed them, had watched him face death with courage and dignity. They had heard his final words about the value of their own lives and minds. That knowledge could not be taken away, even by death. The literacy lessons that had cost Josiah his life continued in secret. Adults taught children, older slaves shared their knowledge with younger ones, and gradually, the dangerous gift of reading and writing spread through the quarters. They were careful, always watching for spies and informants, but they were also determined to honor. Josiah sacrificed by preserving and expanding the knowledge he had died to share. One of those children was a boy named Marcus, who had been 8 years old when Josiah first showed him how to write his name in the dirt. Marcus had watched the execution with tears streaming down his face. But he had also memorized every word of Josiah's final speech. Over the months that followed, he became one of the most dedicated students in the secret schools that met in hidden corners of the plantation. By his 12th birthday, Marcus could read as well as many white children his age. He had devoured every scrap of printed material he could find, from discarded newspapers to fragments of books. Most importantly, he had learned to write, carefully practicing his letters on pieces of bark and stolen paper. Marcus became the keeper of Josiah's legacy on the plantation. He wrote down the stories that older slaves told about the rebellion, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost. He copied passages from the Bible that spoke of freedom and justice, sharing them with others who found comfort in the promise of divine liberation. He even began composing his own writings, poems about freedom, letters to the family he had never met, and essays about the injustice of slavery. As Marcus grew older, he began to organize more systematic resistance activities. He helped coordinate work slowdowns during harvest season, spread information about underground railroad routes, and maintained correspondence with abolitionists in the North, who had been inspired by Josiah's story. The network of literate slaves that had grown from Josiah's teachings became a powerful force for resistance throughout the region. They shared intelligence about harsh overseers and cruel masters, warned each other about slave catchers and patrol schedules, maintained connections that stretched across state lines. By 1860, the year before the Civil War began, this network had become so extensive that it functioned almost like a shadow government among the enslaved population of Georgia. They had their own communication systems, their own methods of mutual aid, and their own plans for the day when freedom might become possible. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in October 1859, just 2 months after Josiah's execution, slaves of Riverside Plantation were among the first in Georgia to learn about it. The news spread through their networks faster than official reports reached the white population, and it sparked intense discussions about the possibility of broader rebellion. Marcus, now 17 and recognized as a leader among the younger slaves, organized secret meetings to discuss what Brown's raid might mean for their own struggle. They debated whether they should attempt their own uprising, whether they should try to escape en masse to join Brown's forces, or whether they should wait for better opportunities. The decision they reached reflected the wisdom that Josiah had tried to impart. That resistance took many forms, and that survival sometimes required patience as well as courage. They would continue their work of education and organization, preparing for whatever opportunities the future might bring, but they would not throw their lives away in hopeless gestures. That decision proved prescient when the Civil War began in April 1861. The slaves of Riverside's plantation were better prepared than most for the chaos and opportunities that the war would bring. Their literacy allowed them to understand news reports and military dispatches. Their networks provided them with intelligence about troop movements and battle outcomes. Their organizational skills helped them coordinate responses to the rapidly changing situation. When Union forces began advancing into Georgia in 1864, Marcus was ready. At 21, he had become the unofficial leader of the resistance network that had grown from Josiah's teachings. He had maintained correspondence with Northern abolitionists, had maps of escape routes hidden throughout the plantation, and had organized the slaves into groups that could move quickly when the opportunity arose. The opportunity came in November, when General William Tecumseh Sherman's army approached Milledgeville during its march to the sea. As Confederate forces retreated and civil authority collapsed, Marcus led nearly half of Riverside Plantation's slave population in a mass escape to Union lines. They took with them not just their own freedom, but also intelligence about Confederate positions, detailed knowledge of local geography, and most importantly, the educational foundation that would allow them to build new lives as free people. Marcus himself joined the Union Army as a scout and interpreter, using his literacy and local knowledge to help Sherman's forces navigate the Georgia countryside. After the war, he became a teacher and political organizer during Reconstruction. Working to ensure that the freedom his people had, one would be accompanied by education and political rights, he never forgot the man who had made his own education possible in 1867 when he established a school for freed slaves in Milledgeville. He named it the Josiah Freeman Institute. Above the entrance, he inscribed the words from Josiah's final speech, "Remember that your minds are your own." The school became one of the most successful educational institutions for freed slaves in Georgia, producing teachers, ministers, political leaders, and skilled workers who carried Josiah's legacy forward into the next generation. But Marcus was not the only one whose life had been transformed by Josiah's sacrifice. Throughout the South, enslaved people who had heard his story found courage to resist in their own ways, escape to freedom. Others organized within the plantation system. Still others used their skills and knowledge to help fellow slaves survive and thrive despite the brutal conditions they faced. Reverend McKnight, the minister who had smuggled Josiah's writings to the North, underwent his own transformation. The experience of witnessing Josiah's courage and dignity had shattered his ability to reconcile Christianity with slavery. He began preaching subtly subversive sermons that emphasized the equality of all souls before God. He used his position to help enslaved people in small but meaningful ways, teaching them to read under the guise of Bible study, providing them with information about the outside world, and gradually becoming an ally in their struggle for freedom. When the Civil War began, McKnight openly declared his support for abolition. Despite the social and economic costs of taking such a position in Georgia, he lost his position at Riverside Plantation and was ostracized by much of the white community. But he found a new calling working with missionary societies that provided education and aid to freed slaves. In his later years, McKnight wrote extensively about his experiences with Josiah and the impact that the condemned man's courage had on his own spiritual journey. His memoir, Witnessing Freedom: How a Condemned Slave Taught Me to See God, became an important document in the literature of abolition and Christian social justice. The ripple effects of Josiah's actions continued to spread long after his death. His story was taught in schools throughout the North, inspiring a generation of young people to commit themselves to the cause of racial justice. His writings were translated into multiple languages and distributed internationally, helping to build global support for American abolition. Perhaps most importantly, his example provided a model for how individuals could resist oppression while maintaining their dignity and humanity. He had shown that even in the most desperate circumstances, people could choose how to respond to injustice. They could choose courage over cowardice, dignity over degradation, love over hate. This lesson resonated far beyond the specific context of American slavery. In the decades following the Civil War, activists around the world drew inspiration from Josiah's story as they fought against colonialism, racism, and other forms of systematic oppression. In the 1960s, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis explicitly referenced Josiah Freeman as an example of principled resistance to unjust authority. They saw in his willingness to accept death rather than submit to degradation a precursor to their own philosophy of nonviolent resistance to racial segregation. The children whom Josiah had taught to write their names in the dirt grew up to become parents and grandparents who passed on not just literacy, but also the values that literacy represented: the belief in human dignity, the importance of education, the power of knowledge to transform lives and societies. By the turn of the 20th century, Riverside Plantation had been subdivided and sold to small farmers, both black and white. The slave quarters had been torn down, and the great house had fallen into disrepair. But the school that Marcus had established in Milledgeville continued to thrive. And similar institutions throughout the South carried on the educational mission that Josiah had died to defend. In 1909, 50 years after Josiah's execution, the school held a commemoration ceremony in his honor. Marcus, now an elderly man, but still sharp and articulate, delivered the keynote address to an audience that included dozens of people whose lives had been directly or indirectly shaped by Josiah's sacrifice. "We gather today not to mourn a death," Marcus said, "but to celebrate a life that continues to live in each of us." Josiah Freeman died on a Georgia gallows, but his spirit walks free in every classroom where our children learn to read, in every voting booth where our people exercise their rights, in every moment when we choose dignity over submission and truth over comfortable lies. The ceremony also included the dedication of a monument to Josiah, simple granite stone inscribed with his name, dates, and the words he died so others might live free. It was the first public memorial to an enslaved person erected in Georgia since the end of the Civil War, and its installation represented a significant shift in how Southern communities were beginning to acknowledge their history. But perhaps the most moving part of the ceremony was the reading of letters from around the country from teachers, ministers, lawyers, doctors, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by Josiah's story. They wrote about how his example had inspired them to stand up against injustice in their own communities, how his words had given them courage during difficult times, how his sacrifice had reminded them that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences. One letter came from a young woman named Sarah Washington, great-granddaughter of Isaiah Washington, the freed slave who had operated one of the Underground Railroad safe houses. She was attending college in Massachusetts, something that would have been impossible for a black woman in her grandmother's generation. And she wrote about how Josiah's story had inspired her to become a teacher herself. "I know that I stand on the shoulders of people like Josiah Freeman," she wrote. "His courage made my education possible. His sacrifice opened doors that I walk through every day. I hope to honor his memory by dedicating my life to ensuring that all children, regardless of their race or circumstances, have access to the knowledge that sets people free." Another letter came from a group of white ministers in Atlanta who had formed an organization dedicated to promoting racial reconciliation. They wrote about how Josiah's story had challenged them to examine their own complicity in systems of oppression and had inspired them to work for justice rather than simply preaching about it. These letters and hundreds of others like them demonstrated the enduring power of Josiah's example, his refusal to be broken by slavery, his commitment to education and human dignity, his willingness to sacrifice his life for principles larger than himself. These qualities continued to inspire people across racial, regional, and generational lines as the 20th century progressed and the civil rights movement gained momentum. Josiah Freeman's story took on new relevance. In 1959, exactly 100 years after his execution, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a series of commemorative events that used his example to inspire a new generation of activists. Dr. King himself spoke at one of these events, drawing explicit parallels between Josiah's sacrifice and the philosophy of nonviolent resistance that was transforming the American South. Like our brother Josiah Freeman, King said, we must be willing to face suffering and even death rather than accept the degradation of our humanity. We must be willing to fill the jails, to endure the violence of our oppressors, to sacrifice our comfort and safety for the cause of justice. The sit-in movement, the freedom rides, The march from Selma to Montgomery, all of these pivotal moments in the civil rights struggle, drew spiritual and practical inspiration from the example that Josiah had set more than a century earlier. Young activists like John Lewis, who was beaten nearly to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, specifically cited Josiah Freeman as someone who had shown them that courage in the face of overwhelming odds was not just possible, but necessary. "He taught us that we are more than our circumstances," Lewis said in a 1965 interview. "He showed us that even when they control our bodies, they cannot control our spirits unless we let them. That lesson was worth dying for in 1859, and it's worth suffering for today." The story of Josiah Freeman also became an important part of the historical education that was transforming how Americans understood their past. For decades after the Civil War, the history of slavery had been minimized or romanticized in American textbooks. Enslaved people were portrayed as passive victims rather than active resistors, and the brutal realities of plantation life were glossed over or ignored entirely. But by the 1960s, historians like John Hope Franklin and Kenneth Stamp were producing more honest and comprehensive accounts of the slavery experience. Josiah's story, preserved in the writings he had smuggled out of his death row cell and in the testimonies of people like Marcus and Reverend McKnight, became an important part of this historical revision. His narrative provided concrete details about plantation life, slave resistance, and the psychological impact of bondage that challenged earlier historical narratives. More importantly, it demonstrated the complexity and humanity of enslaved people, showing them as individuals capable of intellectual growth, moral reasoning, and heroic action. This more accurate historical understanding had important contemporary implications. It helped Americans understand that racial inequality was not the natural result of inherent differences between races, but the product of specific historical injustices that could and should be addressed through deliberate action. By the 1970s, Josiah Freeman's story was being taught in high schools and colleges throughout the country. His writings were included in anthologies of American literature. His life was the subject of academic papers and popular biographies, and his example continued to inspire new generations of activists and scholars. The civil rights movement had achieved many of its initial goals. Legal segregation had been outlawed, voting rights had been secured, and overt discrimination had been prohibited in most areas of American life. But racial inequality persisted in more subtle forms, and activists continued to draw inspiration from historical figures like Josiah, who had faced seemingly impossible odds with courage and determination in the 1980s and 1990s. The country grappled with issues of economic inequality, educational disparities, and criminal justice reform. Josiah's emphasis on education as a tool of liberation took on new relevance. Community organizers working in inner-city neighborhoods often invoked his memory when advocating for better schools and expanded educational opportunities. His famous words, "Remember that your minds are your own," became a rallying cry for parents fighting against inadequate funding for public schools, for students demanding culturally relevant curricula, for teachers working to inspire children who had been told by society that they were not capable of academic success. The Josiah Freeman Institute, the school that Marcus had established in his honor, continued to operate well into the 20th century. Although it eventually merged with the public school system during desegregation, its alumni included dozens of teachers, ministers, lawyers, who carried its founder's legacy forward into new contexts. In 1985, the Institute's former building was designated as a National Historic Landmark, and it became the centerpiece of a museum dedicated to the history of African American education in the South. The museum's exhibits tell the story of how enslaved people like Josiah risked everything to learn and teach, how they built educational institutions during Reconstruction, and how they continued to fight for equal access to quality education. Throughout the Civil Rights era and beyond, visitors to the museum often comment on the power of Josiah's story to speak across the centuries. Children who toured the exhibits are amazed that someone would risk death simply to teach others to read and write. Adults are moved by his courage and inspired by the long-term impact of his sacrifice. But perhaps the most important lesson that visitors take away is the understanding that individual actions no matter how small they might seem at the time, can have consequences that extend far beyond what their actors could have imagined. Josiah Freeman thought he was simply defending his right to teach children their letters. He could not have foreseen that his death would inspire a resistance movement, that his writings would influence the abolition cause, that his example would guide civil rights activists a century later, or that his name would be honored in schools. In museums throughout the country, this lesson has contemporary relevance for people grappling with their own decisions about how to respond to injustice. Like Josiah, they may not be able to see the full consequences of their actions, but they can choose to act with courage and integrity, trusting that their examples will inspire others and contribute to the long-term struggle for human dignity and equality. As the 21st century began, Josiah Freeman's story took on new dimensions of relevance. The rise of mass incarceration in the United States had created what many scholars described as a new Jim Crow, a system of racial control that, while different from slavery, shared many of its essential characteristics. Young black men, in particular, faced rates of imprisonment that were unprecedented in American history. Many of them were convicted of nonviolent drug offenses and sentenced to terms that were disproportionate to their crimes. Like Josiah, they found themselves condemned by a legal system that seemed designed to perpetuate racial inequality rather than to provide true justice. In this context, Josiah's story resonated with a new generation of activists working for criminal justice reform. This example of maintaining dignity and purpose even while facing execution provided a model for incarcerated people who refused to be defined by their circumstances. Prison education programs throughout the country began using his writings as teaching materials, finding that his emphasis on the liberating power of literacy spoke directly to men and women who were seeking to transform their lives through learning. One such program, established at a maximum security prison in Georgia not far from where Riverside Plantation had once stood, was specifically designed around Josiah's educational philosophy. Inmates studied his writings alongside works by other historical figures who had faced oppression, and they wrote their own essays about resistance, dignity. Many of the participants in this program credited Josiah's example with helping them find purpose and direction during their incarceration. They spoke about how his refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond his control had inspired them to focus on what they could control: their attitudes, their commitment to learning, their relationships with family and friends. When they were released, these former inmates often became advocates for criminal justice reform, drawing explicitly on Josiah's legacy as they worked to change the systems that had imprisoned them. They understood, as he had, that individual transformation was meaningless without broader social change, and they dedicated themselves to ensuring that others would not face the same injustices they had experienced. The digital age brought new opportunities to share Josiah's story with global audiences. His writings were digitized and made available online, allowing people around the world to read his first-hand account of slavery and resistance. His story was featured in documentaries, podcasts, and educational websites that reached audiences that previous generations of historians and activists could never have imagined. Social media campaigns used his words and example to inspire contemporary movements for social justice. During the Black Lives Matter protests of the 2010s, activists often shared quotes from his final speech, finding in his words a connection to their own struggles against police violence and systemic racism. International human rights organizations also drew inspiration from his story as they worked to combat modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. His example demonstrated that even people in the most desperate circumstances could find ways to resist oppression and maintain their human dignity. In 2009, exactly 150 years after Josiah's execution, President Barack Obama referenced his story. During a speech about the importance of education in breaking cycles of poverty and inequality, Josiah Freeman understood something that we must never forget, Obama said. Education is not just about individual advancement. It's about collective liberation. When we teach our children to read and write, to think critically, and dream boldly, we are not just preparing them for success. We are preparing them to transform the world. The threads of freedom that Josiah helped to weave into the fabric of American history remain strong, connecting his struggle to our own, his sacrifice to our opportunities, his faith to our hope for a more just and equitable future. In the end, he achieved what he set out to do on that distant plantation in Georgia. He proved that the human spirit cannot be broken, that knowledge cannot be destroyed, and that love is indeed stronger than hate. These truths, written in his blood and preserved in his words, continue to guide us toward the freedom that he died to defend, the freedom that belongs to all people. In all times, as an inheritance that no earthly power can revoke, Josiah Freeman's story reminds us that we are all connected across time and space by our shared humanity, our common struggles, and our collective hope for a world where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. His voice joins the great chorus of freedom that echoes through history, calling each generation to take up the work of liberation and carry it forward to the next. The weight of chains has been lifted, but the work of freedom continues. And in that work, in that struggle, in that hope, Josiah Freeman lives still.